Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, January 10th, 2022. And I'm the host of the show, Cara Santamaria. We are back. It's our first show of the year. We started this podcast in 2014, and now we are, I am airing episode 389. Thank you guys so much for sticking with me through all of this. It's been an absolute joy. And I do want to remind you, as I do each episode, that Talk Nerdy is and will always be 100% free to download. And the way I keep this little show going is through selling ads on the show and also through listener support. If you would like to support the show, all you've got to do is visit patreon.com/talknerdy, and you'll see all the different tiers and what you get for them, including at the $2 tier, an ad-free version of the show. So this week, I want to give a big old shout out to the top tier supporters, starting with the coolest people in the universe. They include Daniel Lang, David J.E. Smith, and Mary Neva. And the coolest people in the galaxy are Brian Holden, Christopher Pitts, Dudas Infinitas, Gabriel F. Jaramillo Gonzalez, June Sapara, Leonard Prince, and Ulrika Hagman. Thank you all so much. All right, let's dive into this week's episode. Let's talk about it. So I've got a fascinating show for you. I had the opportunity to sit down with Dr. Raghuveer Parthasarathy, and he is a biophysicist who wrote a brand new book, So Simple a Beginning, How 4 Physical Principles Shape Our Living World. This book is available in February of this month. You can actually pre-order it right now, pretty much anywhere that you buy books. Dr. Parthasarathy is the Alec and Kay Keith Professor of Physics at the University of Oregon. He's a member of the Institute of Molecular Biology and the Material Science Institute there, and hails from Eugene. So without any further ado, here he is, Dr. Raghuveer Parthasarathy. Well, Raghuveer, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks. Thanks a lot for having me.
I am looking forward to talking all about your new book, So Simple a Beginning. But before we dive into it, I have to just say up front, I realized when looking at your bio that you, since you're at the University of Oregon, you actually live in Eugene, which is where one of my very best friends lives. And I've been seeing all this snow on her Instagram, and I'm super jealous.
It is very unusual. We get typically something between like 0 and 2 days of snow a year. So when it does snow, it's quite an event. And it paralyzes the city, of course, as well. So
of course, yeah. It's like the rain down here in LA, which has been incessant for the past 2 weeks, but we need it. But yeah, you guys had a legit white Christmas. What a rare treat.
It is, yeah. And it reminds me, I actually spent 5 years in Chicago. That's where I went to graduate school. And it reminds me that snow is really beautiful, but I really dislike being cold. Sort of conflicting thoughts in my mind about all that.
But you're still pretty far north. I mean, Pacific Northwest, it gets pretty cold. I mean, for somebody who doesn't like the cold, you picked a spot where you're going to be dealing with
cold.
it.
My threshold is freezing, basically. Like if it's above freezing, I'm okay. And I actually don't mind like sort of clouds and drizzle and stuff like that. So that's okay with me. But once it gets to below freezing, I just feel like it just seeps into all my bones, and like there's no glove that's ever been invented that keeps my fingers warm.
For real, it's so painful. And of course, I'm living here in LA. It's like 55 out today, and I'm like, oh God, it's too cold. You definitely adapt. It's so funny depending on where you live. I mean, the fact that you spent 5 years in Chicago, talk about cold wind.
Oh yeah, I mean, there were some days I would be just walking around downtown, going somewhere or something like that, and I would sit there wondering, like, who put a city here? Like, what were they thinking?
So where did you grow up?
I grew up actually, not too far from you, mostly in San Diego, so yeah, Southern California. I was born in India, but my parents moved to the U.S. when I was about a year old. I lived in Minnesota a little bit, but I was a small child. But from like third grade through high school, Southern California.
Oh, cool. So this might be kind of an ignorant question, but I'm curious. If you moved here when you were 1, did you have to go through the full, or have you, or did you decide to go through the full naturalization process?
I did become a naturalized citizen when I forget if it was 12 or 14, but it was just before, I was just young enough that I didn't have to take the test, but I did have to,
Ah,
fill out the forms and go through
yeah.
the ceremony, which was quite nice. So I still
Oh,
remember
cool.
that.
So there's still a ceremony for kiddos, but they don't have to do quite as much homework.
Correct. Yeah. Or at least that
That's
was the
good to
case,
know.
when I did it, which was a while
Yeah.
ago now, but yeah. Yeah.
That's good to know.
Yeah.
So, growing up in Southern California, were you always like a physics nerd? Is this something that came to you? Were you like a science kid, or is it something that
Yeah,
came to you
so
later in life?
that's an interesting question, and it's also an interesting one that even relates to my book and the things I work on now, because so I work on this field of biophysics, which is kind of like this intersection or mashup between physics and biology, and everybody comes to that from kind of different ways. And for me, like when I was a kid, I was definitely interested in like math and science, and I was actually interested in physics more than anything else. And so when I went to college, which was at UC Berkeley, my default plan, I started out intending to be a physics major, and I did major in physics, but I couldn't stand biology. I was, or maybe couldn't stand is perhaps too strong, but I had no interest in biology, and it didn't mesh with what I thought I liked, sort of at all. I was interested in physics. I was interested in math. I was interested in astronomy also, and
You
actually
were my
started out
equal and
college.
opposite.
Oh,
I was like all bio all the time. Like,
oh,
please don't
interesting.
make
Yeah.
me take another
Well,
physics course.
well, like I was saying, this biophysics, just where I'm at now, people come at it from all kinds of different routes, which
Yeah,
is
yeah,
actually one of the
yeah.
things that makes it a fun field. But yeah, I had this real love of the kind of ability of physics to sort of predict things and say things about the natural world, and especially to do it like quantitatively and kind of exactly and stuff like that. And I was interested in astronomy too, and I started as a double major in physics and astronomy. And I actually ended up dropping the astronomy major, not because I found it uninteresting, but actually ended up being involved in this wonderful project to build, like an undergraduate project to build a radio telescope. So a bunch of us put just tons of time into this and built this working radio telescope on the roof of one of the buildings at Berkeley, and pointed it up at the galaxy, and you could measure how fast the galaxy was rotating and stuff like that. And it was a lot of work, but it was really extremely rewarding. But I became more and more fascinated by the fact that you could build this thing that can detect these little weak little radio waves, that are so weak that the total sum, the total of all the power in them that's hitting the entire surface of the Earth is less than that of a 100-watt light bulb. But you can build something that detects that. And I thought, that's really cool. That's actually even cooler than the hydrogen we're pointing the telescope at. So I kind of moved more and more towards kind of the more tangible end of physics. And that took me, well, I'll skip over a lot of the intermediate steps, but it took me to even things that are really tangible, that you can sit there and poke your arm and see how squishy you are, and like what are the physical properties of like living things. And so that's been a fun journey.
Oh, I love that. And so you really came to the biophysics through the how does stuff work? What are the sort
Yeah.
of subcomponents? How do we detect them? But in doing so, did you discover an interest or a love for biology, or is it
Oh, very
still kind of
much.
like
Yeah.
in the corner?
No, 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 no. I mean, I now I just absolutely adore biology, um, and I have to say, I think this is something that is also maybe mirrored in people with the opposite experiences of mine. I really love biology. I'm not terribly fond of the way it's taught often.
Oh, yeah, sure,
Um,
sure.
and I think people often say the same kind of thing about physics, and yeah, I think there's a lot that can be done on both realms. Um, but yeah, I adore biology, and I should say even throughout, like even when I was in high school and things, I wasn't fond of biology as a subject, but I love being outside and sort of nature and those sorts of things. Um, and now I find biology itself just utterly fascinating. But one of the things that I find kind of most amazing about it is that it has all these just wonderful phenomena and creatures and substances and activities and all of that. But it turns out that it is actually possible to like say precise things about it and quantitative things about it. And that actually helps us like understand it and even illuminate how remarkable some of these things are. So, now this is very much, I think, kind of a biophysical perspective. You don't sort of see these things as like opposite in how we can tackle them, but as very sort of complementary or conjoined.
It is interesting how, for many people, I think, many scientists especially, who develop a passion for a subject or for a construct, they enter it through a certain discipline. And very
Hmm.
often that discipline really serves as a window to another discipline
Yeah.
that maybe felt untouchable. I had a very similar experience because my background was psychology and philosophy, and that's how I found biology, was through neuroscience. So
Ah,
I
mhm,
came at it
mhm.
from a behavior, and I want to describe behavior, and oh my gosh, look at all the cool things that are happening at the network level and the cellular level. And then of course my professor through my master's, which was in neuroscience, was a biophysicist. He was a neurophysicist,
Mhm,
and
mhm.
actually a physiologist. And so I learned a lot of physics through that, but it was all very related to nerve cell transmission.
Yeah.
And
Mhm.
it was cool. It was really cool to see a whole side of this subject that I never got in, intro to physics class.
Right. Yeah, and it is really true that, yeah, especially, having a background in one thing and kind of using that as a stepping stone to another, I think really gives you maybe a better appreciation for both of them.
Yeah, for sure. And of course, you're in this field that's so multidisciplinary. Like, you have to really consider it from all angles. And I feel like to some extent, it's very hard to stay siloed in the sciences in the modern world because almost nothing is siloed anymore.
That's true. Yeah. I mean, there are people who do it, but but I don't know why. Yeah.
Right. Like we know so much now, and there's still obviously so much more to know, but we know so much about the natural world that you can't really speak of a phenomenon without speaking of the chemistry, the physics, the biology, like all of the different components of that phenomenon.
Yes. Hmm.
And so okay, you take a book that is so not simple and describe it from this sort of foundational point of simplicity, right? So simple at beginning, how four physical principles shape our living world. So, of course, even the cover image is this idea of this branching,
Hmm.
increasing in complexity sort of uh, phenomenon, because we can go down to basic principles, and you
Hmm.
do in the book. You focus on four specific ones that sort of are foundational, but so much complexity, so much almost in seemingly ostensibly inscrutable, but of course is scrutable complexity comes from these four basic principles.
Yes. Hmm.
So talk
Yeah.
to me about that.
Yes.
Like how do you, I mean, really, it's like, how do you even determine what is the fundamental without getting too fundamental? It's like frogs all the
Right.
way down.
Well, I
Like
think this.
how do you
Yeah.
split?
Well, I think this really comes to the notion of what do we mean by principles, and this is something that I think kind of most happy about with the book, and it really took a lot of time thinking. What are the kind of themes that make sense of that allow us to make sense of a lot of this complexity. And so one of them, so I'll illustrate what they are, but one of them, which is I think very kind of visceral and very powerful, is this idea that nature, not just living things, but this is really predominant in the living world, makes use of this idea of self-assembly, and that is just this notion that the instructions for how something is put together are kind of encoded in the thing themselves. So to be concrete with a non-biological example, this is one I actually have like in the introduction that maybe like so simple it seems like obvious to people, but it's worth thinking about. You blow a soap bubble, and we've all done this. It's lots of fun. You can go home and do it in your kitchen again. But you blow a soap bubble, and you get this nice um, spherical shape. And you can ask yourself, well, why is it a sphere? And we all know that nobody had to sit there and you know poke at the soap bubble and turn it into a sphere. You didn't do anything like that. It just turned itself into a sphere, and that's because it is made up of a liquid, and it turns out that liquids, all the molecules in a liquid, they like to be next to one another, so they don't like to be at a surface. So they try to just make the smallest surface that they can, and the shape with the smallest surface for some amount of volume is a sphere. So we can say that that soap bubble just assembles itself into this spherical shape. So that notion is a really, really general one. And continuing with soap bubbles, there's something else you can try at home. And it's a bit challenging to do this as a podcast because I have illustrations of this in the book, but
Yeah.
you can't even see me waving my hands in the form of illustrations. But if you go to your kitchen, take some dish soap, blow some soap bubbles, and get them to set on a piece of wax paper or some like wet surface or something like that, and you have like 4 soap bubbles that are touching, what you'll find is that there's a very particular arrangement that they make. You'll never get them with their kind of borders making an X. So they're all kind of coming together at like 4 corners. That you'll never ever find that. Instead, you'll get something where the junction looks kind of like an H with twisted arms, or sorry, with H with bent arms. So something where 2 are touching each other, and then you have 2 kind of on the side.
Right.
And there again, you didn't have to make that shape. That's just what 4 soap bubbles will do. So what some people have noticed, now going to living things, if you look at the cells in the fly's retina, or so a fly, you have these compound eyes, you have these photoreceptor cells in each of those compound units, and there are these groups of 4 cells. And you look at them under the microscope, and what they look like is that exact same pattern that 4 soap bubbles make. So the arrangement of cells looks very much like what 4 soap bubbles would make, the same angles, the same, 2 things contacting each other and 2 things to the side. So what a couple of researchers did is, they made that observation like many others have, and they looked at mutant flies that instead of 4 have like 3 or 5 or 6 or whatever of these photoreceptor cells. And they, it turns out, make exactly the same arrangement as 3 or 5 or 6 or whatever soap bubbles make. So what it tells you, or at least what it strongly suggests to you, is that the fly doesn't have to sit there and have a gene that positions every photoreceptor cell in each compound eye. It can make these and rely on kind of physical forces, the same things that are pulling soap bubbles into particular arrangements, to put the eye cells in the arrangement that they need to be in.
Right. So the idea here is that it's just simply the most conserved, or maybe a better way to put it, the most efficient way for
That's
the
a way
cells
to
to
think
arrange
about it.
themselves.
Yeah, the most kind of efficient or energetically favorable, or
Right.
the thing that physical forces would make if you just let them do their thing.
Right. Like you don't have to put anything extra into the system to get it there. It's like the least amount of energy required.
Exactly. And nature does this all the time. So like the boundaries of your cells, you have a cell membrane. So this amazing, essentially 2 molecule thick layer of stuff that's mostly made up of these molecules called lipids that have a part that's very much like soap molecules. Part of them likes water, part of them doesn't.
Right. They're phospholipids.
Exactly. Yes. So these membranes, they're absolutely crucial. If your membranes disappeared, you would die in an instant.
Right.
They're exceptionally important things. So you might ask yourself, okay, what protein sits there and makes a membrane, or what gene encodes the shape of a membrane? And the answer is there is none.
Right, because the lipids just stick to each other.
Exactly. Yeah. The cell just makes the lipids, and lipids, if you just take a bunch of lipids and toss them into water, they will form themselves into a membrane shape, just because that's the shape that takes the parts that don't like water and hides them away from the water in sort of the interior part of this membrane.
Everybody's seen it when they make a really fatty broth. There's literally a skin that forms on top. That's what that is. Yeah.
So this notion that life just really loves to make use of self-assembly, that you don't have to specify the biochemical reaction or the specific location of all these things. You can make the stuff, and the stuff encodes its own instructions. That's a theme that just makes so many things make sense.
Yeah. Okay. So, and self-assembly is something that it seems like, tell me if I'm wrong. I've been doing SciComm now for probably coming up on 15 years and covering, all different fields. And when you see material science articles dropping, it seems like there's always a real push for self-assembly within material science? Like, how do we get certain materials to
Oh, definitely.
do this
Definitely.
on their own? Yeah.
So, yes, and actually, it's neat that you brought that up because that actually more directly was my path to biophysics.
Right, right.
I actually did
Okay.
my PhD work. I had a little bit of sort of a biophysical side project, but the bulk of what I got my PhD in back at the University of Chicago was actually something non-biological. It was getting like gold nanocrystals or making kind of electrical devices out of little gold nanoparticles.
Hmm.
And the key to it was getting them to assemble themselves. So we would coat them
Right.
with particular things, and they would, just from physical forces, you'd get this kind of beautiful hexagonal lattice of particles. And then if you messed it up, you'd get bad lattices and stuff like that. And you'd have
Yeah,
to,
yeah, and then they wouldn't be as
it would,
strong or,
yeah,
yeah, as
yeah, or
functional.
electrical current wouldn't flow through in the same way,
Right.
stuff like that. So I found that like just really fascinating. And
Oh,
once we kind
yeah.
of figured out what to do, the technique was, yeah, we put the right coating on. We had our nanoparticles in liquid. We put that on a chip. We went out, got some coffee, came back, and it had assembled itself into this beautiful lattice.
I love that. Oh, that's so, and of course we see this all the time with like actual crystals
Oh,
with
of
different
course, yes,
minerals and
yes,
stuff, the way
yeah,
that they just
yeah,
sort of quote grow,
yeah,
even though they're not alive, which is
right.
very cool and self-organize. And I remember even, my own experience when I was doing, like I said, back in my master's, like way back when, I was doing work in a cell culture laboratory, and we were working with what we called monolayer nerve cell networks. So
Hmm.
we would
Hmm.
I would do this very complicated thing where I had to take these mice that weren't yet born and take their brains out and remove the
Hmm.
individual portions of the brains and separate the cells out so that they were just individual cells, and using all these different solutions and stuff, put them on these little plates, and they would just grow into nerve cell networks.
Yeah.
They would
Hmm.
just grow into these flat networks on their own. And of course, there we do have a lot of coding
Hmm.
involved, right? There's the trophic factors and the tropic factors and all the things that are released that tell the neurites to grow in whatever direction they grow. But in a way, that also is a form of self
Oh,
assembly.
very much, yes. Yes, and that's something that I also touch on in the book. It's great that you brought up that specific example because you can think about kind of simple things like nanostructures, and then actually from there in my own career I went to studying membranes. In fact, and this
Mm-hmm.
kind of one step up in kind of sophistication example of self-assembly that brought me to like actual living things. But then one of the currently just super exciting topics in kind of science slash biotechnology is building what are called like organoids. So
Yes. Oh my
yeah.
gosh.
So I
I
have a
thought,
chapter on that. Yeah, exactly.
oh,
And
yeah. I
it's
just covered a story recently about this one
oh, fantastic.
organoid that was built that had eye spots. Did you see
Oh, yeah,
that?
yeah, 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 yeah.
And
And
they just spontaneously developed, like they didn't plan for that.
right. And there's a similar eye organoid thing where cells that form into what would be um, sorry, cells that make up what is normally like the optic cup that has this kind of concave shape, in
Mhm.
our 3D petri dish also adopt like a curved shape.
Oh, it's
Um,
so cool.
so, I mean, this is very much kind of an open question and sort of ongoing. But yeah, what aspects of things like organ formation are sort of the necessary complex biochemistry, and what parts are okay? The cells responding to particular cues have particular properties, and then because of that, they assemble themselves into particular forms. And we don't know in a deep sense or in a thorough sense the answer to that, but it's becoming really clear that it really is a mix of those two things. Um, there is some complicated biochemistry and stuff, but there really is self-assembly even at these higher levels of organization of like whole organs.
I mean, there must be. It sort of really does throw this massive paradigm shift into the view of developmental biology. I think so
Yes.
often people look at um, uh, genetic abnormalities or developmental abnormalities and they focus on, look at what went wrong, look at what went wrong. But very often, I think the real question is, look at all the stuff that went right in spite of the fact that this went wrong. Like this
Yeah.
one thing misaligned or miscalculated or miscoded or whatever, but everything else in a very resilient way built up around it as if that thing wasn't wrong. And that
Right.
happens a
Mhm.
lot.
Yeah, yeah. And we've had hints of this for a very long time. There are these, classic studies of early developmental biology about probably a bit over 100 years old, where people did things like taking cells from like an early stage, like starfish embryo or sea urchin embryo or things like that. And if you took a particular subset of cells, you could regenerate the entire organism from just a piece of it. Or you could move things around from one part to another, and depending on the timing and things like that, you would have things that could actually grow up into the correct thing just based on the kind of structural cues from their neighborhood.
Yeah, I did that when I remember in middle school, I think if we were in 8th grade, my partner and I, Ashley Reed, shout out, we did a science fair project and like we won, something like second place at state or regionals or
Wow.
something. Yeah, it was with flatworms, planaria, because you can legit cut them in half and they just reassemble, which is really cool. So yeah, we would teach them a maze and then we would cut them in half and see if both halves knew the maze. And it was a really cool experiment to see, like a fun thing that, very young, curious scientists could do. But there's a million ways that you could look at that data and make some pretty interesting inferences and really have some of these more philosophical conversations about what that means.
Yeah, very much. It's interesting also, like, I mean, the philosophical side of it comes up in like a lot of different ways in like contemporary things, related to ethics and stuff like that. But even in a lot of these older things, one of these pioneers, it's a story I put into a whole chapter on development in here, but I'm very bad with remembering names. I have to even look back at what I wrote. But
same. Yeah, always.
So, one of these people, Hans Driesch, who was a German biologist working in Italy, he realized, you could take, a cell from an early stage sea urchin embryo, move it from its normal position to a different one, and despite that shuffling, the sea urchin would develop like normally. It's as if the transported cell, knew its new environment and acted accordingly. It became, the mouth instead of the whatever else. And he was so freaked out by this that he actually abandoned the study of developmental biology and became a philosophy professor. Because he thought, there's no way we can make sense of this. It's telling us that, we should give up. And thankfully, other people did not give up.
That's amazing.
And the field of developmental biology did not come to a dead end. But it was, even at the time, it was really kind of clear that these are deep things. This notion of like self-assembly and like what can and can't it give you, and so on.
Yeah, and of course, it's one of four that I don't want to say arbitrarily because it's not arbitrary. Like you really dug deep into sort of your own, I guess, your own taxonomy of this.
It is fair to say it's not like a canonical set of four. I like it's my set of four, but it's and you probably get different lists from different biophysicists. But
and to be fair, even canon is as I've spoken about often on the show, and I think more specifically when I had Lulu Miller on the show to talk about her amazing book Why Fish Don't Exist. The idea of it's
on my list.
It's incredible. But it really grapples with the idea of taxonomy, categorization, that even canon, even things that we think of as being like almost law, it's still constructed. These are still ideas that human beings are grappling with observations and trying to categorize these observations. And so there's always still going to be some amount of bias, whether it's generational bias, whether it's, it's like this very sort of structure of, Kuhnian, like structure of scientific revolutions. Like there's always going to be something built into it. And so your four categories are probably, objectively, obviously they are meaningful, but also deeply meaningful to you because of the work that you've done and how you have sort of developed your own relationship with biophysics. Yeah. So self-assembly, one that I think makes a lot of sense to me sort of intuitively, although it probably is a very complicated thing if it's the first time you've heard of it. But one that doesn't make that much sense to me intuitively is the idea of regulatory circuits.
Good. Yeah.
Yeah, this one I think I need a little more help with.
Yeah, this might be the most kind of abstract of them. But so here I think a good way to start out thinking about this is these days, everybody, even if they can't really define it, everybody's heard of genes. They know that genes, in some sense, are these pieces of information that are carried along by our DNA. Even if they can't sort of precisely say what's there. But there's this kind of remarkable thing that, first of all, you really don't have that many genes. You have, depending on how you look at it, 20,000-ish genes. So that's 20,000 kind of instructions that a cell, like one of your cells, has at its disposal, like 20,000 different
Yeah, it's
proteins it can
actually
make.
it's a big number, but when you think about how complex we are
Exactly.
as
Yeah. It is a
species,
big number, but yeah, when you put it very well, when you think about all the different things that you do, from digestion to immune responses to vision to hearing, 20,000 is not that big. What's more, your skin cell, like, one of your skin cells has exactly the same genes, exactly the same genome as one of your neurons. And it's the same genome that's also in, one of your muscle cells and so on. But clearly these are doing different things. So that in itself tells us, there's some higher level of complexity here. And what a lot of that is basically turning particular genes on and off at different times and also in response to other things. So to be a bit more concrete with that, let's imagine, and this is sort of one of the classic examples, you are a bacterium and you're swimming around and you want to eat sugars. And so you have a gene that encodes for a protein that digests that sugar. So that's great. If you turn on that gene, you get that protein, you can digest that sugar. But it costs energy to make that protein. You don't want to be doing it if there's no sugar around. So what do? Well, one very common tactic is you have something that blocks that gene from being turned on. But that thing that blocks the gene from being turned on can also bind to that sugar. And if it's bound to that sugar, it's not going to block the gene. So if you
right. So
find
now
the
there's a
sugar,
signal.
exactly, there's a
Yeah,
signal
yeah.
and there's this kind of circuit. If I find the sugar, I stop blocking the gene, I turn on that gene, and I make more of the proteins that will digest that sugar.
I see.
So
So
it's
you're
kind of
seeing this as almost like an electrical circuit, this sort of
yeah,
biological circuit.
exactly,
Okay.
exactly,
Okay.
and it's not even that. Or I guess a better way to put it, it can be a pretty exact analogy even. So, you have these things that can regulate whether like genes are turned on and off. And what's more, they can do actually the same sorts of operations that like electrical circuits do.
Right.
So
So they're
inside
like
your
little
computer, and
resistors or
yeah,
little
or little logic gates,
capacitors. Yeah,
actually.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because, in your computer, you have something that is, turning on a voltage if this signal is on and that one is off. So you have this, language of ones and zeros and circuitry that says, okay, if this is a one and that's a one, make that a zero. If that's a zero and that's a one, make that a one. All these combinations of and or and stuff like that, that all together can like kind of synthesize different inputs and make different decisions. Well, it turns out this kind of circuitry of am I turning on genes and turning off genes can do the same things. You can have things where if I have sugar A and sugar B, then I'm going to turn on this sugar digesting protein. But if I have sugar A and sugar B isn't there, then I won't.
Right, right. Because I can like metabolize that one way easier and I
Oh,
don't need this
exactly,
whole
exactly,
circuitry anymore.
exactly. Yeah.
I
So you
love
can make
that.
kind of preferences and decisions. You can do basically computing. And even
Yeah.
the simplest bacterium, it turns out, does this,
Right.
which is
Right.
really cool, and which like it also points out a way that complexity is generated from simplicity. Because just like your computer, it doesn't need, there's not like 1,000 different types of transistor. It just needs one type, but with lots of connections between them that can make these kind of regulatory calculations. You can get a lot more out of the genes you have by doing these combinations of things.
Yeah, which again sort of like goes back to this idea of like what is the most efficient? Like
Right,
what is the
right.
least amount of energy that I need to use to be able to like do this biological process?
Yeah, that's a good way of thinking about it. Because because now if you flip that around and say, okay, if I didn't have these circuits, what would my genome have to look like? How massive would
Mhm.
it have to be
Yeah, it'd be like the
to,
Constitution with like a million amendments
yes,
added to it.
there
It's
wouldn't be
like,
room
oh
for the rest of
gosh.
me. There would be like, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, this also goes to I mean, the thing that sort of comes up for me in my weird brain that has a lot of weird connections is this never ending like debate or discussion that you always hear about nature versus nurture. And it's like,
Oh, right, right.
it's
Yeah.
both. Like, this
Yeah.
is such an example of it's both. You have these genetic instructions that only go into effect if and when you
Exactly. So
encounter
both
something in your
things. Exactly.
environment.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
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 And that's everything from the type of personality you'll develop as an adult to the
Hmm.
way that a bacterium metabolizes the sugar.
Yeah. And you have like feedback through all these, and like, you can put yourself in one kind of state of a circuit and just stay there stably until you get a signal to go into like another state. And this, relates to things like memory and stuff like that as
Yeah,
well.
totally. It,
Yeah.
it it really does have a lot of explanatory value across multiple constructs, everywhere from like the complexity of the sort of human or mammalian brain, but even
Right.
down to
Right.
like these very basic metabolic kind of processes.
Yeah. And yeah, so this one is again one that kind of cascades across scales. Like, it's relevant to kind of how, bacteria or even, other single cells work, but also, broader things like organs. And one of the coolest things is that you can almost anything you can think of making as an electrical circuit, you can make as a biological circuit. And in many cases, nature does. Like, you can have things where like one gene affects another in like a rhythmic sort of cycle. So you can make a clock, something that, rhythmically expresses itself. And people have built these artificially for various biotechnological purposes. So you can have something that like glows green, periodically every minute or something. But then your like nature makes use of this as well. So things like the regularity of like the spacing of your vertebrae are actually because of irregularity in time of a clock that was going on when you were when you were an early embryo, that was like synchronizing certain activities happening with like periods of growth.
Oh yeah, yeah. It's funny you mentioned that people might like it code or like develop something that glows like every minute or whatever. And like the first thing I thought of was the little dino flagellates that I have in my office, these little like algae that actually glow. They bioluminesce, but only at night.
Oh, yeah,
And
yeah, yeah.
and when you first get your shipment, they say, make sure it's in a room that gets plenty of light, but also goes dark at night because they need to resync back to their clocks. Like,
Exactly. Yeah.
you can't just always have them in the dark. They'll die. They'll lose their capacity. Or if they're always in the light, they'll never glow. But if there's a cycle, they will readapt to it, which of course, we all know as the circadian cycle that
Exactly.
we
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
we know and love, and sometimes don't love so much.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah, and of course, there's so many examples of that um, throughout, like, all of biodiversity, not just in terms of, circadian types of intrinsic clocks, but, pacemaker cells and,
Oh,
just,
of
like,
course.
there's
Yes.
so
Right.
many examples, which is
Yeah.
so cool.
Yeah. Yeah, there's even, examples spanning organisms. Like, there are these fireflies that will like synchronize together and all like flash at the same time.
Ah,
There's beautiful
that's
videos
so
of this.
cool. Yeah, the,
Yeah, I
like
think they're in Malaysia or something like that.
all that sort of really neat, like, hive mind research, like looking at kind of bees and cooperative movement and communication with bees and looking at like murmurations of birds and
Right.
insects and things. It's like super fascinating and must be fundamentally important and interesting to people who study biophysics and material science.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And that's been that area of like kind of flocks and, yeah, these kind of collective ensembles of organisms is one that's really taken off in the last kind of 10 years or so, especially because like tools for observing these have gotten so much like better and cheaper. You can have like arrays of cameras that, watch your starlings flying around, and
Yeah.
it's really beautiful.
Oh, I love it. Yeah, there's like a lot of kind of big data and citizen
Exactly.
science that can
Yeah.
be
Yeah. Yeah.
cool. And so it's interesting because you mentioned with regards to regulatory circuits, but I think it also applies to self-assembly, that it's something that kind of happens across scale. And it's funny that you say that because one of your four principles
Oh, yes.
is scaling. But before we
Yep.
get to scaling, is predictable randomness, the third, also
Yes.
something that occurs across scales?
Yeah. So, short answer is yes, but the kind of most important manifestation of it is really microscopic. So here, well, sort of, first of all, in a broad sense, what I mean by this theme is that there are a lot of things in the living world that are random. And nature actually makes use of that randomness and the fact that something can be random but still have kind of well defined properties on average. So the kind of most important and maybe even most fundamental manifestation of this is something called Brownian motion, which a lot of people I think have seen in like high school. But basically, what it is if you look in a microscope, just at little specks of dust or something like that, like in water, you'll find that they're always jiggling around. And this, it turns out, is something you can just, again, go to just a little tabletop microscope and see that stuff is never still; it's jiggling around. But it turns out it's one of the like deepest phenomena in the universe. It's really amazing. And it was actually something discovered by a biologist, a botanist, Robert Brown, in the 19th century, who realized, yeah, he was looking at actually these little specks inside of pollen grains and found that they were jiggling around. And he did these beautifully careful experiments that established that this was not because of anything to do with life, but just because that's what stuff did. That
Right. Things bounce
fundamentally
around.
things bounce around.
If there's
Yeah,
space to do it, they'll bounce around.
exactly. And the smaller something is, the more relative to the size that it's bouncing around. And so
Right.
big
And
stuff, you
this
don't
is
see your,
fundamental to diffusion, osmosis. It's fundamental to how
exactly.
drugs work. It's fundamental to everything.
Exactly, exactly. And so nature, because this is just everywhere, you can't get away from it, nor do you actually really want to get away from it. So there's all sorts of things where nature takes something, puts it nearby where it needs to go, and then relies on this random, chaotic motion to do the rest, like
Right. To just let
neurotransmitters.
them bind. Like eventually something will fall into a spot that it fits in.
Exactly, exactly. So, like, right now in each of us, we have these chemical synapses that are sending signals between like neurons in our brain. You have like one neuron and then a little gap with fluid and then another neuron. And that first neuron just releases some neurotransmitters into that little gap. And they have to get to the other neuron. And you might think there's some little fairy system or cables or whatever that do it, but no, they're just there in that space. They'll jiggle around, and randomly at some point, some of them will get to the other one, and that's the signal. So you again don't have to like hardwire everything or have a little machine that exactly puts everything in its space. You can rely on these random behaviors, and the fact that you know if you know how big little particles are and what the space is they need to go across, you can predict on average how long it'll take a signal to get across, and that's a perfectly good average.
You're right, but it's always a prediction. And this is, I
Yeah.
mean, just as like another example, to be clear, because this is something that always makes me crazy when there's a bit of a lack of understanding about this. This is why drugs have side effects.
Oh yeah, yeah,
Because
yeah.
when you swallow medicine and these little molecules go all through the body, however the route of administration allows them, if they go into the bloodstream, if they, there's different routes, but wherever that medicine ends up, it's going to bind to whatever it binds to. And sometimes it's the target and sometimes it's not what we were going for, which is why sometimes, especially I think of things like chemotherapy, because I work as a therapist in a cancer center. So I see this a lot. And very often, one of the biggest concerns that I'll hear from patients as they change drugs is they'll say, I'm not as sick on this drug, or this drug doesn't make me feel as bad. Maybe it's not working. And it's like, just because it has fewer side effects doesn't mean its activity is lessened, but we're so used to thinking that way. We think that the side effects are something that happen downstream to the mechanism of action, but that's not what a drug is. A drug just binds where it's going to bind because it's just moving around.
Yeah, well, and I think even more broadly, people somehow we do a poor job educating people about randomness in general. Like, there's a
Yes.
real resistance to believing that randomness exists.
When everything is right. I mean, this is
Yeah,
this is
yeah,
what the principle of stochasticity.
yeah, yeah,
Like,
yeah,
I
exactly,
love
yeah.
this word stochastic.
Mhm.
It's that everything is random, but maybe kind of predictable, but also random.
Exactly, exactly. Just realizing you can have exactly the same conditions and just variation in what the output is. That's a real eye opener to a lot of people. I teach a lot of like classes for non-science majors, and which is a lot of fun. But that's one of the things that really takes some work and is really kind of a revelation to a lot of people.
I think for me, it a lot of this came to fruition not from my science training, but from my statistics training, that
Oh,
when I
interesting.
really, started to grapple with cognitive biases around things like just straight up probability and flipping a coin, that if just because I got heads 3 times in a row, it has no effect on what happens next. But
Uh-huh.
we as, psychological creatures want to think that these things are all related to one another, that, oh,
Mhm.
I'm going to break a streak. It's why gambling, works, right? It's why people drop so much money in Vegas. But the more that you really grapple with, I think, probability, I believe that the better your sort of appreciation for scale, for randomness, for the sort of what actually truly is connected and what's not, like just the difference between drawing a card with replacement or not, right? If I'm
Right,
going to draw a
right.
card out of a deck 10 times in a row, but the card is not replaced in the deck, it's going to completely change my
Very different.
odds.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I don't know. I also love poker. And so maybe that's why all this stuff kind of speaks
I
to me.
see.
But I do think that
Actually,
sort of,
that probably gave you better handle on statistics than a lot of things.
oh, hell yes. That's actually
Yeah.
another book that I've recently had, not recently now, but Maria Konnikova come on the
Oh, I
show to
read
talk
that.
about. It's so good, right? And
Yes,
these
yes.
these
The confidence game,
fundamental,
you mean?
yes, the
Yes,
confidence
yeah, I
game.
read, yeah.
And oh, actually, no, she's done another one
Oh,
since the confidence game. Confidence game
oh,
is
really?
also great. Yeah, that's the one that she wrote pre-Trump, but like a lot of it's about Trump, right? Isn't the confidence game the one about or maybe this is her poker one. No. The confidence game is the one about con artists. Yeah, which
Exactly.
is
It's about
so
con
good.
artists. Yeah.
Yeah, that was like the book that put her on the map. But she also did a recent book. So, I mean, long story short, I'm not going to let Maria's episode co-opt our episode. But she decided to, for a book, learn how to play poker, and then she ended up like winning a seat at the World Series because she's so freaking good. And so she wrote a book called The Biggest Bluff, and it's literally all about these fundamental poker principles and chaos theory and stochasticity and like how they sort of explain a lot of first principles, which I think is really cool, and speaks a little bit to even this. I mean, I don't think she really goes there much in the book with like biology, but that this kind of biological predictability is all a function of probability because of
Yeah.
randomness.
Yes, and I mean the other place this comes up that's extremely important just for like current society is in understanding things like genetic diseases. And so I spent a while on this in the book. We have there are various disorders that are really the fault of one gene, like cystic fibrosis or something like that. But then there's a lot of things, a lot of traits, both good and bad, and even some things as kind of innocuous as like height that seem to be the manifestation of like thousands of different genes. And so I mean, you can almost think of them as like thousands of coin flips, and you have some kind of random ensemble of these and some kind of average probability uh, uh, that they give you, for a particular height or something like that. But there's a variation around that, and so understanding, what can and can't you do with these sorts of things really does require having a decent grasp of, what does randomness mean, and yeah, what can we say and not say.
You're so right. And I think for anybody who's like engaged in a consumer genetic testing product, which, we could have a whole separate conversation about the ethics of, sending off your entire genome to a corporation, and then them coding it for you. But there's something cool about, like, I remember doing 23andMe, and early on in the days, like, the sort of readouts were a little bit more crude, but now there's so much education built into the platform. And one of the things that I think is so cool is that, each trait that they're describing is a prediction. They describe it
Right.
as a prediction. And what I love is when they get it wrong, because it really
Yeah,
shows
yeah.
you. Like, my 23andMe says I should likely be blonde, which blows my mind. So my
Uh-huh.
genes are basically, if you just read my genes, my genotype, not my phenotype, but my genotype, it's saying probably maybe she'll be blonde, and my phenotype's like black hair. It's like there's
Yeah.
no way. And I love that because it goes to show that this is a probabilistic
Exactly. Yeah,
calculation.
yeah. And I think having this information is great. I'm actually quite optimistic about what we can do with that and so on. But like, yeah, I think if one if somebody went into this thinking, oh, it's predicting I'm going to be blonde, that means there's a 100% chance I'll be blonde. Um, you know.
And that's where it gets
That's the thing we
dangerous
have to
when it
educate
says,
against. Yeah.
yeah, like you have these markers for this disease. That doesn't mean you're going to get it, but you might have a higher likelihood. And then it becomes a risk benefit calculation. Very often, like what I do with my patients, like I work with a lot of patients in end of life or in recurrent situations where they're really grappling with the extension of life using modern medicine and quality of life. And sort of it's a complex algorithm that we have to determine. And I think it's the same thing with genetic counseling, right? This idea that if the disease is more severe and if the likelihood is higher, then the calculation becomes different than if the disease is less severe and the
Exactly.
likelihood is
Yes. Yes.
lower.
Hmm.
Yeah. Interesting. So give me another example then of the way that predictable randomness. I mean, we talked about Brownian motion, so like basic atoms, or small molecules are like buzzing around everywhere. And then, it continues, but as things get larger, right? Like you said, it's a little bit less obvious, but are there examples of like macro scales of this?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, macro scales, um, almost more by analogy, like things like having, like we were just talking about, like multiple genes that are all contributing a small amount to one phenotype, essentially giving you a sort of predictable randomness to an overall trait and things like that. That
Right.
is
Yeah,
where I see
yeah.
more of the how that theme manifests itself at the larger scales. I mean,
That
it
makes
is true
sense.
that I should point out, in other contexts, like turbulence in ocean waters, how whales feed and swim and stuff like that affects things, and there's randomness associated with large scale fluid flows and stuff
Oh,
like
you're
that. So there
right.
is that sort of thing also.
And even
Yeah.
cosmologically, probably I mean, I bet you cosmologists often have to kind of calculate in a error bars on, this supernova or
Oh,
these
of course.
two,
Yeah.
things
Yeah.
colliding or whatever,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
because of that. It's like, well, it's predictive and it could do this and it could do that. It's but based on if it does this, then it'll
Right. Exactly.
determine whether
So
it does the next thing.
yeah. Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
I love it.
Definitely.
I love it. So good. Okay, so the last one, of course, that you mentioned is scaling, and I think scaling is it's sort of its own animal in a way, like its own
Yeah.
beast, because it applies to the first three and then some. So give us a
Yes.
little lowdown on scaling.
Yeah. So what I mean here is just the idea that um, thing like the importance of different physical forces can be different at different sizes, and this seems um, kind of obvious, but it's one where again, if you kind of think about it, it makes a lot of things make sense. Like for example, you look at an elephant and it has really thick bones. And it's not just that it has thick bones. Um, if you compare like an elephant and a cat, it's not that the elephant is 10 times taller and its bones are 10 times wider. It's 10 times taller and its bones are 20 times wider. It has disproportionately thick bones. And we could see things like this all over the place, that things, properties seem to depend on size. And so you can ask, okay, why is that? And so it's because of this idea that different forces scale differently. So, like coming to the elephant, what's the elephant leg trying to do? It's keeping the elephant up. So we have like gravity pulling the elephant down, and that force of gravity depends on the mass of the elephant, like the total volume of elephantness that you have. And so that depends on this volume of the elephant. But how strong a bone is depends on its area, like the cross sectional area. And this isn't just particular to bones. This is sort of a thing that's true about beams, whether they're concrete beams or whatever.
Okay, so like scaffolding in general
Yeah, scaffolding in
requires.
general.
Okay, all right.
I mean, there's different ways things can fail, but at least if you're squishing something kind of lengthwise, it depends on the area there. So you can imagine, let's suppose you took an animal and you made it twice as wide, twice as deep, twice as tall. You would make it 8 times as massive, so 2 times 2 times 2. But its legs, like its area, would be just 4 times bigger. And so if you just kept everything proportional, like the size of its legs being the same proportionality to its body as would normally be the case, it would be getting more massive and have more of a force of gravity than the force of its bones could withstand.
Oh
So
yeah,
your
it would
animal would
be
collapse.
recipe for osteoporosis.
Exactly.
It's
Yeah.
just like terrible.
So just this basic thing that like gravity depends on the mass of an object and the bone strength depends on the area. that automatically tells you that bigger animals are going to have disproportionately thick bones to keep up with that extra mass. And so that, it turns out, is what animals do.
And do they
Bigger.
scale predictably? Like, I know it's
Oh,
not
so that's
linear, but is it like
right.
logarithmic?
So that's a beautiful question. So the answer is sometimes.
Okay,
If
all
you look
right.
at particular families of animals, and I give things like antelopes and wildebeest and these so-called bovids as an example in the book, they actually do scale with the proportionality that makes their bones keep up with their mass. So it
Okay, and
turns
that
out
sort of
that
makes sense from an evolutionary perspective
exactly they
because
have
they
similar kind of lifestyles and
yeah,
behaviors. The
yeah.
antelope runs along, the wildebeest runs along, the little tiny dik runs along. They're doing similar things. So they they scale their bones to make these physical forces work out in the same way.
Right, but, like, bird bones are inherently different from
Yeah,
antelope
exactly,
bones,
exactly.
so,
Yeah.
yeah,
So if
you're
you
gonna
cross
see a
to
different
different
scaling.
sets of things, and even the elephant, its bones are thicker, but they're still not actually as thick as they would have to have the kind of relative strength of an antelope.
Oh,
So
yeah, right, because they don't bound.
exactly. So if you've
Yeah.
ever wondered, why can't elephants jump? It's because if their bones were strong enough to support them jumping, their bones would have to be like twice as big as they presently are. They basically would just be all bone. It'd be a horrible way
You
to
know
live as
what's
an elephant.
it's so funny, this is, like, the weirdest little anecdote, but I remember spending time in, Namibia and being at a, reserve and being outdoors in this area where the lodging was, and it was sort of on an elevated, like, terraced, ground, and there were all these we're very lucky that we were in this place where there's so much wildlife, and the only animals that would come up to where the lodging was were antelope, um, baboons, and, like, a couple of kind of annoying critters, but there were big scary animals out there. There were, like, massive elephants and massive rhino, and it was like they were right there, and I was like, "Oh my god, they're gonna come here," and it's like, "Nope, they can't climb up that little
Oh
lip."
yeah.
Like,
Yep.
they literally can't get up here because they
Yeah.
can't lift their legs high enough, and they don't jump.
Yeah, they don't
And it
jump.
was
Yep.
it was
Yep.
amazing to see, like, they can rear up on their back legs to reach things in trees,
Yeah.
but then they can't use
Hmm.
their front legs to continue the motion. So I was right there, so close to these horrifyingly dangerous creatures, but doesn't matter because
They
they
can't
can't
jump.
climb,
Yep.
like, 6 feet.
Yep.
It's amazing.
Yeah. Yeah. It is pretty remarkable. Um,
So, okay, so this idea that scales happen somewhat disproportionately, sometimes proportionally, but sometimes disproportionately, obviously becomes important for things like quantum mechanics, right? Like this is a whole
oh, that's true.
new
Also,
version
yeah.
of scaling. Like
Yeah. Yeah.
things get
Yeah.
super weird when they're really small or really
Right.
big.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, so this is actually kind of a ubiquitous theme in a lot of physical things, just like, you know, the importance of different forces or different phenomena have different dependencies on size. So they're kind of balanced with each other. Yeah. Depends on scale. And then the challenge is to kind of understand, okay, what is the underlying reason for that scaling behavior that we observe? So, like in the example I gave, we can see that the bigger animals have disproportionately thick bones. What is that telling us? And it's telling us about this interplay between like gravity and strength. But you can observe that scaling, and then can you make sense of it?
I love that. And it's sort of for me it has explanatory power, like really simple explanatory power. And this is coming from a non-physicist, so you tell me if I'm like the mark here. Between sort of Newtonian physics and Einsteinian or sort of like newer modeling of things that like when Newton and when like sort of early basic physics was first being described, it was very much based on a human scale. Like, it was very much based on what we could observe with the tools we had that were earthbound. And
Yeah,
then things started to get more complicated when we realized that, like, other parts of the universe have different gravity, or they don't have different gravity, the force is
yeah,
the same,
yeah,
but
yeah.
we measure it differently because of the mass of the objects in it. It's bent differently, and space-time is different, and so we had to start thinking about all these things in a way that was more complex because we weren't just operating on the human scale.
I mean, that's totally true. It's interesting. You don't even have to go to quantum mechanics for that. Like going back to like predictable randomness and Brownian motion, you know, that's not even quantum mechanical, but it's away from kind of our human scale of everyday experience. So we don't actually have um, we're not born with a good intuition for the fact that everything is jiggling around. Like
You're right.
it's so
Yeah.
foreign to our experience.
And this is something we talk about a lot in sort of the skeptic movement and,
Right,
neuropsychological
right.
humility is that we evolved to exist on a planet with green plants and with, food sources that were here, here, and here, and with predators and prey. And like we evolved a lot of our basic sort of quote instincts or tendencies on planet Earth with
Yep,
these
exactly.
pressures
Yep.
and we evolved that way and then they don't always serve us. They help us survive. It's like god, I just brought this up the other day. It's like Robert Sapolsky's famous book Why Zebras Don't Get
Oh yeah, yeah.
Ulcers,
Hmm.
right? Like zebras never developed chronic stress like human beings did. But like all of
Yeah.
our biological and psychological machinery that we evolved over hundreds of thousands of years, like didn't really anticipate being in a stressed out situation for longer than a few minutes,
Right, right.
and so all bad stuff happens now because we've kind of messed with that scale a little bit.
Yeah, it is really amazing how like the scales we're used to. It's just it takes real work to like internalize the fact that there's all these other scales out there that are important.
Yeah, and I guess I misspoke before when not that I misspoke because I was talking about quantum mechanics at the very small and the very big, but moving from Newtonian more to relativity, right? Just this
Oh
idea
yeah.
of like, and that's kind of what the name implies, right? That things are different at relative scales. I love it. Oh gosh, that's really cool. Okay, so we've got these four things. We've got self-assembly, regulatory circuits, predictable randomness, and scaling. And I'm curious for you as a basic researcher, but also who, is interested in and grapples with and has done some applied research as well. How do these four sort of categories um influence your thinking as you look into material science, into biophysics, into translational science in these areas?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I mean, I think one of the things that, like in my own research, really, I try to do a lot of is trying to figure out what aspects of things that we see, can be explained by kind of generic or simpler physical processes. So my research lab here at the University of Oregon, most of what we do is actually looking at the gut microbiome. Um, and these days, I think everybody's heard of the gut microbiome. We carry along this kind of virtual organ of trillions of microbes, mostly in our intestines, that do important things. And so my lab has been looking at these and looking in actually the literal sense. So we build microscopes that are good at 3D imaging and look at zebrafish, which are pretty transparent at young ages, so we can actually see inside their guts. And we've been doing things like actually watching bacterial colonies of different species like grow and bacteria swim around and things like that. And you can see kind of a range of different behaviors of whether things are aggregated or swimming or stuff like that. And there's this wonderfully rich variety. But then you can also ask yourself, okay, are there any kind of underlying rules that might help us, be able to make predictions and actually say something about why some species take over from other species or some species are unstable or things like that. So we do things like, okay, if we look at, you know, clusters of bacteria, is it just random or are there patterns to like what you get in terms of clusters? And that's like, we found, for example, that there are kind of patterns that, you have this kind of process by which small clusters seed larger clusters, which seed larger clusters. But then the larger you get, the more likely it is you'll be transported out of the gut as the gut transports stuff along. So there's this kind of uh, equilibrium in a way of all the different kind of sizes of things you get. And certain things like antibiotics can actually perturb that equilibrium. And so you could see signatures of that in like these cluster sizes. So it definitely influences my work in like, motivating these kind of questions. Can you find kind of rules of physical structure and stuff like that apply to these things? And the answer, I should point out, isn't always yes. Sometimes there's things where it really does look like it's the details of what the bacteria are doing that are key. But more often than you might think, there are kind of underlying physical processes that do help explain stuff.
And it's so fundamentally important, from a basic curiosity level, right? Just trying to make sense of, I mean, that's what science is and has always been, right? Is just trying to make
Yeah.
some amount of sense of the observations of the natural world around us, but also from an applied perspective.
Yeah.
I mean, there's so many like health consequences, medical potential medical strategies that can be taken if we understand even just the way that like bacteria layer or bacteria
Yeah.
clump or
Yeah.
bacteria
Yeah.
move. I mean, we would have, you think about people who are septic or people who are dealing with like these intractable infections. Like, how can we utilize physical principles on top of
Right.
drug
Yeah.
principle? You know, I love
Exactly.
that.
Yeah. And actually, one of the things that motivated our antibiotic work was the fact that there's actually a lot of antibiotic contamination in the environment. So, like, I think something like 70% of the world's rivers have like pretty sizable amounts of antibiotics like found in them, mostly from like livestock
Oh, I was going to
runoff
say, is
and
it
those sorts of
literally
things.
because we're like peeing antibiotics into our
No,
toilets? Okay.
it's because we're feeding lots and lots of antibiotics to farm animals.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, we forget. That's another scale thing. We
that's
forget
it is actually
how
that
many
dwarfs.
cows there
Yeah,
are to every
exactly.
person.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
There's a beautiful. You've probably seen this, but a beautiful XKCD graphic of that. Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's wonderful. Um, so anyway, like these concentrations of antibiotics, they're like sublethal like, to the antibiotics, or sorry, to the bacteria. But it turns out people have found that low doses of antibiotics could still like really perturb the human gut microbiome. But it's been unclear like why. Like why do low doses of antibiotics do anything? So that actually motivated us to look at these low antibiotic doses um, in zebrafish and see these sort of structural changes, like what actually happens when you have like weak antibiotics in a microbiome.
Oh wow, that's fascinating. Yeah, so there's also and I think this applies to the scaling principle, maybe even to a couple others, but there is this dose response kind of curve
Yes. Oh,
that has
totally. Yeah. Yeah.
large
Hmm.
implications.
Yeah.
Oh, it's just fascinating. So, Raghuveer, there's so much more that we could be talking about. I could keep you for hours and hours and hours. I feel like we did a pretty decent summary
I think so.
of the
Yeah.
four physical principles that shape our living world. I do close every episode by asking my guests the same two big questions. But before we get into that segment, I'm just curious if there's anything that we didn't touch on or anything we didn't cover that you feel like, oh, why didn't we talk about that?
I think that's good. I think perhaps the one thing that's worth noting is that the whole last part of the book really deals with DNA reading and writing, so the technology for like reading genomes and also now with CRISPR, like editing them. And that was a lot of fun to write and really made a lot of things crystallize in my mind. And it's not obvious, but it turns out a lot of this really hinges on these sort of physical properties of like DNA and other things. And also, kind of like we hinted at with predictable randomness, I think understanding their consequences and what you can and can't do with them really also requires an understanding of like what they physically are. So
Right.
yeah, I had
Oh,
a
and
lot of
that
fun with
probably
that.
has implications for things like data storage. Like, that's been a huge
Oh yes.
conversation on, yeah, it's like, how can we use DNA and the coding mechanisms to like store data? Because we're like running out of space for all of our data. But you need to really understand the actual physics, like the way that these things move and
And just
bind.
the
And
DNA is a physical object. It takes up space. It has some stiffness
yes,
to it. Yeah, like
yeah, we
I
don't
mean,
think about
again,
that.
it
We
seems
think of
kind
it
of
as
obvious, but yeah, that's not. My older son is in high school and he studied DNA and biology. And it's like, did you guys talk about the fact that DNA has a really strong electrical charge? Nope.
nope. Yeah, I mean,
Even though it's
I
like
think.
central to like so many things.
Yeah, because people still think often of DNA the way that Darwin did before DNA was even
Yeah,
described, that it was like a discrete entity that had an impact on different, or like the way that Mendel talked about it. It
right,
wasn't
exactly.
DNA
Before
yet.
we
It
knew it
was
was
like
stuff. Yeah,
it was these like packets of pressures, or we didn't
right.
know what it was. Yeah. So yeah, but we now, yeah, it's actual stuff. It's
It's actual
molecules,
stuff.
it's made stuff, and it does stuff. It's got, like you said, it's charged, and it's got things it wants to stick to and things it wants to repel from. And oh, that's really cool. Okay, okay, I'm loving it. I'm loving it. There was something else that was about to come up in my head. The other thing, because I know you're not going to toot your own horn in this way, is that, guys, this book, this is the coolest thing. You did all of your own art for the book,
Yes. Yep.
and so you did these drawings and these watercolors to like to visualize a lot of these things. How long have you been doing art?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, I, a little bit since high school, but it's really more since maybe graduate school, something like that. So let's call it 20, 25 years.
Okay, so a
But
long time. Is it something that you've always used as sort of a tool to communicate your science?
well, actually, since I was a postdoctoral researcher, so for the last 20 years or so, yes, like I've actually liked making sort of little schematics and stuff like that. And I got kind of more, I mean, they were generally really awful. And I got kind of more serious about this. I'm not quite sure why, but I think when I started as a professor here at the University of Oregon, I think I just decided in general to spend what little free time I had doing some more drawing. Well, what free time I had that was not hanging around with my wonderful kids and trying to do some useful things in general, but trying to spend some time drawing. And I got, I think, a bit more serious about it. But I have like made use of that for like diagrams for actual like scientific papers, and I've gotten a couple of journal covers too from that as well. So also, like I mentioned, I teach classes for especially for non-science major undergraduates, and one of those is actually a class called the Physics of Life, which was kind of the proto version of some of the things in this book. And for that, I also wanted to make things like handouts and stuff for the students, so I would like make illustrations for that. So
Oh, cool.
yeah,
Oh
so
gosh, I never
it's
got
been an ongoing
anything
thing.
like that when I was a student. I didn't get any cool illustrations from my professors that they did themselves. I love that. Except maybe some like crappy like schematics that were made in MS Paint or something like that. I don't know. Oh, I love that. That's so cool.
So it's
Okay,
been a
so
lot of fun. Yeah,
yeah, for sure. And I mean, of course, so much of this, if we can visualize it, and especially in an artistic way, I think it really brings it to life. Because some of these things you can't see,
right, exactly. Yeah, yeah.
or we can kind of see them, but not really at the level of detail that we want to talk about. All right, so I'm curious. I have these two big questions. They're very big picture questions. So are you ready to go there with
I'm
me?
ready. Go
Okay,
for it.
so I want you to think about the future in whatever context is relevant to you today, which is sort of loaded because we are living in unprecedented times. But you can think about this in terms of scale, everywhere from something very personal, something professional, something community oriented, global, even cosmic. When you think about the future, I want you to tell me first, what is the thing that's keeping you up the most at night? The thing you're most kind of concerned about, maybe even pessimistic, borderline cynical about? What's really, really worrisome to you? And then, let's flip that so that we end on a more positive note. Where are you finding your hope lately? Where are you finding your optimism? What are you looking forward to?
Hmm. Those are wonderful questions. So it's good that you start off with the pessimistic one.
Right. Yeah. I'm always a bad news first kind of person. So.
Yeah. Well, okay, on the pessimistic side, the thing I'm most pessimistic about is actually not COVID related, but I feel like we as a society have a hard time dealing with kind of the deluge of information and kind of the deluge of voices um, out there. So one of the most remarkable books I read in the past year um, was by Martin Gurri. It's called The Revolt of the Public and the Crisis of Authority in the New Millennium. It's kind of a mouthful of a title. But he's sort of a political scientist and kind of crystallizes a lot of things that have been kind of going through my mind that, we used to have this world that wasn't great, but like there were there were authoritative sources like certain news organizations or governments or things like that that for better or for worse were kind of treated as authorities. And now, information is dispersed. We have millions of people tweeting, which could be great, but what we seem to have is sort of um, a sea of opposition without construction. So, to give a quote from that, the public opposes but does not propose. So, almost a sort of nihilism of tearing things down without a clear path forward for putting things together. And a lack of trust then in what used to be the entities that we did trust to keep things together. So,
Yeah, it's almost like there's been a pendulum swing from like historical sort of um uh dictatorial rule, right? This idea
mhm,
that there historically was like strong authoritarian rule in most
right,
nations. Um although there have been, periods of enlightenment and stuff, there's still usually been a sort of uh, some sort of ocracy,
Right.
and maybe whether it was a plutocracy or whether it was a meritocracy or whatever, there was, or an aristocracy. There were the people that you trusted. And then we sort of started to swing the pendulum to say, okay, it's not about these people being anointed by God. It's not about them, they're special because they've always been special or because they married into a special family. It's that these people know what they're talking about because they're enlightened, right?
Uh-huh.
Like these people are educated and they have
Yeah.
expertise. And we've had a long period of people saying, okay, we're going to turn to those who have spent their lives developing expertise about this, and those are going to be the voices that we listen to, even though there's still a bit of that, like, oh, just because they're the president I believe everything they say,
Right.
or just because they're a church leader, or whatever the case may be, or a charismatic speaker. And now, yeah, the pendulum is shifting to the point where people are going, I don't even believe the people that know things.
Right.
And I think, like, all people know all things equally. My research on the internet is just as legitimate as your research that you did in a laboratory setting. And it's super worrisome, this swing really far out of, I mean, did you watch
Yeah.
Don't Look Up? Like, that's what this movie
No.
is about. Oh my God, watch
Mhm.
it.
Mhm.
Oh my God. I just watched it 2 nights ago and I'm like still having an existential experience after. It's bitingly funny. It's very
Mhm.
funny, but it is also like you feel quite empty at the end of the
Oh, wow.
movie because it's
Mhm.
such a satire and such a perfect farce of what we're living in right now, taken to an
Yeah.
extreme.
Yeah. So I think, yeah, the question is, how do we keep the fact that everybody, has much more of a voice than they used to, but turn that into something constructive?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And how do we sort of reinvigorate, I don't know, reestablish, maybe not reestablish, maybe re is the wrong prefix to be using, but establish a new way to find trust again.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And I think part of it too, and I mean, not to kind of co-opt this and move in a different direction, but I think part of it is that it has been a natural progression. But I think probably a bigger part is that there has been a concerted disinformation effort and campaign by whether they be nations or groups of individuals that's very agenda driven for political purposes.
I
Um,
think
you
that's
know,
true, but I think
like
that I feel like that just accelerated the inevitable.
you're right. I mean, it did. Yeah, it was an exacerbation for sure. But there's a reason that people glommed onto it, right? There's a
Yeah, that's
reason that
true.
it was not that hard to do, to tip it over. So yeah, this is worrisome to me too. This is actually an existential crisis. So let's switch gears a little and see where you're finding your hope, because you get up every day, you do your work, you continue to write, you continue to hold promise. So where
Yeah.
is that coming from?
Well, I think two things. Like in a personal sense, I do find like what I do, both in terms of like my research and like teaching and communication and stuff. I find it very fulfilling. So I feel like it is a useful thing to be doing, and gets me out of bed in the morning. Um, there are many times when I feel like the difficulties of it have been getting more difficult. The administrative burdens and all kinds of stuff like that. But overall, the positives do outweigh the negatives.
And the COVID
But,
burdens, because those
oh yeah, I
exist
mean,
for
just
sure. Yeah.
the actually one of my grad students and I were talking just earlier today. Like, just things are just so much more difficult than they were like 2 years ago, and um, even if you
Everything.
can't like really articulate why, just everything is difficult
Yeah,
or more difficult than it used to be.
I was just saying how, like, at the hospital where I'm doing my psychotherapy training, like, they're just communications are lost constantly, and like I can't just like see the oncologist in the hall or see
So
the
that's a
psychiatrist in the
big,
hall. Like,
yeah. Mhm.
so all these things go unsaid and because we're all siloed in our little
Right.
houses and we're
I
doing
think
this
we've
stuff
vastly
separately.
underestimated how valuable informal communication is.
Yeah, yeah,
Like
for
just, yeah, hallway
sure.
conversations and stuff.
Wait,
Like,
this is more bad. Where's the
oh
good?
yeah,
Where's the
okay,
good?
right. But on the good side, okay. But yeah,
Yeah.
like I said, personally, the positives outweigh the negatives. But also in a more broad sense, you know, like some other things I've been reading in the past year or so. I read George Orwell's Down and Out in Paris and London, about being like really, really poor. in like the late 1920s or so.
In a time when it would be
And
really hard to be really, really poor.
yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
he literally sells all of his clothes except the ones he's wearing to get like, money to eat. He goes for like about 60 hours or so without eating at one point. And, I mean, just the conditions in general are just stunningly awful. Um, and also another thing I read in the past year were these really wonderful Icelandic sagas, which were gorgeous to read, but everyone in them did spend a huge amount of their time murdering each other and whacking vengeance on the ones who murdered the ones that they love. The time they're not murdering people, they're writing poetry. Anyway, a lot of these things really do highlight, to me at least, that for like we've figured out a lot of we know how. Sorry, how do I put this? Life is much better than it used to be.
Oh,
we've
hell
really
yes.
figured out. I mean, I think people often lose sight of this. Even things like basic sustenance, crime, on all these sort of measures, life is just vastly better. And it's not better for absolutely everybody on the planet, but it's better for a far higher fraction of the planet than it used to be. And that trend is going, ever upwards. The fraction of people who live in desperate poverty, for example, has been, just radically declining for many decades. So, we figured out how to get a lot more food out of, an acre of land. We figured out all kinds of things. So one thing that often just kind of strikes me is basically we've won. we know how to have a, not perfect, but pretty good life. We just need to, we've invented all the tools. So now we just need to kind of implement them. And,
I
that
think,
implementing is still a big step, but, 100 years ago, we couldn't even make that statement that we have the tools there.
it's true. I mean, now so many problems that are facing us, like big existential problems like climate change, are problems of political will. They're not problems of technology necessarily, because we at least have a good starting point. But you're right, like across so many levels, I as a Latina woman would not want to live any time except now.
Exactly. Yeah.
I don't want to go back in the past. And
exactly.
even now it's not great, and I'm hoping for an even better future. But hell no, I'm not going in the past. And I feel like I know a lot of people who could say the same thing.
Yeah, definitely.
Anybody who's LGBTQI plus, anybody who is a person of color, a woman, anything like that. And then you add to that, you're right, these basic metrics like infant mortality, like hunger, like life expectancy and all of that, and they've only gone up. And I think one of the sort of important things to remember, and you're touching on this, but it's something I've been struggling or thinking about a lot lately because I've just been reading a lot. Is like I don't think people are reading as much as they used to.
Oh,
and so much good stuff is in those books, you guys. We don't have to reinvent it.
Yes.
We don't have to, it's there. Well, these ideas have been grappled with for millennia. And there's so many good ideas in these books.
Mm-hmm. I completely agree.
Reading them. Gosh, this has been exhilarating. Thank you so much for being flexible in your scheduling to meet with me during this weird
This has been a lot of fun.
Time. Oh, good. And so everybody, the book is so simple, A Beginning, How 4 Physical Principles Shape Our Living World. Go out and get it. You can pre-order it right now, and it'll be available on February 8th. Very, very soon. So yeah, pre-order it now so that you can get it the day that it comes out. Raghuveer, thank you so much for taking time with me today.
Thanks so much. This was a wonderful, wonderful conversation.
And everybody listening, yeah, me too. And everyone listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together.